All right, everybody, welcome to our webinar, which is Early Action, Using Augmentative and Alternative Communication with the Birth to 5 Population. Where'd this one go? Today presenting is me, Meghan Reitz, and my colleague, Cary Hastings. So I'm going to be talking first, and then about halfway through I will pop it over to Cary. We are both speech-language pathologists at the Children's Hospital of Richmond at VCU and are both on our assistive technology team. So we work a lot with patients that use augmentative and alternative communication. Very briefly, going to go over our learning objectives. After this webinar, we hope that you will be able to define AAC and some of its key components, that you'll be able to dispel at least 3 myths about introducing AAC system with the birth to 5 population, and then also understanding aided language input and how to teach children to use assistive technology. All right, so we first wanted to start out with a poll just so that we could determine who our audience is today. So go ahead and click if you're an early educator, an OT, a PT, an SLP, or somebody else. All right, and I'll give everybody just another moment. Okay, so it looks like we have about half of the people here are speech therapists, a couple early educators, OTs, and others. And whether those others are parents or administrators or case managers, whoever you are, we are happy that you're here, and thank you for joining us today. So our next little poll that we're going to do is just to find out how much experience you all have, so that we can feel like if we need to go into a lot of details or a little bit of details about AAC. So just let us know if you have no experience, some to moderate experience, or a lot of experience. All right, I'm going to give everybody just another moment. Okay. So it looks like we have a lot of people out there that have some experience, a lot of people out there that have quite a bit of experience, and then a couple of you that have no experience whatsoever. So we are going to go into a quick definition and give some examples about what is AAC. So AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, and that includes all forms of communication other than oral speech that are used to express your thoughts, your needs, your wants, and ideas. We all use AAC every day. When we make facial expressions or use gestures, when we use symbols or pictures, or even when we write. Think about all the different types of AAC that you use day to day, such as writing down notes in your agenda, when you text your friends, or emailing a colleague, waving hello to somebody down the hall. There's also lots of AAC out in our environment. For example, stop signs and crosswalk symbols, traffic lights. These are all symbols that stand for something and that have meaning, but they don't use verbal speech. And then we also want to think about children, and especially this early population. Children eventually are going to be in classrooms, and they use gestures such as raising their hands in order to share their ideas and thoughts. So again, there is AAC that is used with this population, even just simply in the classroom. So AAC has a variety of different components. It truly is multimodal, and it permits individuals to use every mode possible to communicate. So it consists of symbols, it consists of different aids that people use, techniques for how they're going to use their AAC system, and then strategies that they're going to use, or strategies that we're going to use to teach them how to use their AAC system. So when we think about AAC, we're not going to just think about a device or a picture board. because it also refers to a range of strategies and intervention techniques that can help somebody be an effective communicator with AAC symbols and aids. And with young children, we often use a variety of AAC, and we call this total communication. So a child may have some verbal speech. They may use a couple of signs. They may have some pictures or gestures that they use. And all of these modalities allows them to communicate their messages in the quickest and easiest way possible for them in that moment. And think about your life day to day. We all are total communicators. So it's important to make sure that we give young children the opportunity to be total communicators as well. So we're going to break AAC down a little further. We have unaided versus aided AAC, and you'll see up here in the picture example, the little girl on the left, she is an example of unaided communication, which relies on the user's body to convey messages. So this is going to be gestures or sign language or watching somebody's body language. And then on the right, the little boy is using aided communication, which requires the use of tools or equipment in addition to the user's body. We're going to break aided AAC down into a couple more categories. So we have no-tech, light-tech, and high-tech solutions. No-tech is something that's readily available. For example, a notepad with a pencil. Somebody that maybe can't talk can write down a message for you. We have light-tech, which for this example could be a picture board or a textbook. And then we have high-tech devices, which are speech-generating devices that produce voice output, and they include multiple methods of access. So people can use these devices to, with a switch to interact with their eyes sometimes, and then often with their hands. So I just put up here a couple of examples of some aided AAC communication. So right here, this first one is going to be a no-tech solution, and then we've got a couple light-tech solutions over here, switches and a Go Talk and a Tech Talk, and then we've got some high-tech solutions. So these are going to be the iPad. This one is an Accent 800 device and a Tobii device. And the high-tech ones, again, are going to have other means of access. So if you can't use your hands to control the device, you can either use switches or some sort of eye gaze. So moving along, let's think about it now. It's just recently 2018. We have children at risk for complex communication disorders being identified earlier. Early intervention services are widely available, and material strategies and technology for these children to communicate improves daily. So the big question here is, why don't we see more young children using AAC? All right, so we're going to talk about some myths around AAC. And these myths are unfounded misconceptions that have been existing for decades, which often prevent people from even investigating the possibility of how AAC could help them or somebody that they know. And these myths are perpetuated by many people. Sometimes it's by the caregivers or the educators, maybe sometimes even by the speech-language pathologist. But what we're going to do today is debunk some of these myths. So our first myth that we're going to go into, what I want you all to do is use your raising hand function, and I want you to raise your hands if you have heard any of the following comments. So I'm going to give 3 comments. Introducing AAC will reduce a person's motivation to improve natural speech and will hinder their language development. AAC should be introduced only after the ability to use natural speech has been completely ruled out. Or if a child has some speech, then AAC is just not necessary. All right, so it looks like a lot of you have your hands raised, which is true for us too. We have definitely heard people saying these. You may have heard people say, we don't want him or her to rely on their device. or we're going to wait and see if her speech improves. Or some people may say, he talks a little bit, or I can understand what he says. So we're going to talk about why this myth is false. So Miller, Light, and Schlossler in 2006 did some research that really showed us a lot about how AAC can actually benefit children and help them improve their verbal speech. So it showed that 89% of the children that were looked at had an increase in speech when introduced with AAC, and 0% of those children had a decrease in their verbal speech. We hear people say, we don't want him to rely on his device. But typically a child can get what he or she wants in the fastest way using verbal speech. So if a child is going to develop verbal speech, using AAC does not keep that from happening, because they're gonna use verbal speech if that's the easiest thing for them. And using AAC, just like verbal speech, it provides these children with a consistent auditory model, and it also can help decrease some of that communicative pressure so that they have some way that they can communicate with us, even if it's not verbal. There's a couple other reasons why this is false too. It can actually help children learn language despite not being able to produce verbal speech. Adults can use the system to model for the children, just like they would with verbal speech, and that can help children's language grow. The child can explore new language. There are no mistakes when using AAC. They can explore new words, even if they don't know what they mean yet. The way that we respond, again, is going to be how they learn. And it also allows children to develop some social skills because it gives them the opportunity to communicate with new people that maybe didn't understand them before or didn't know what their gestures meant when they tried to communicate. And then thinking about the final part of this myth, if the child has some verbal speech, then AAC just simply isn't necessary. We have to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Are their needs being met through verbal speech alone? Is the child's message his or her own, or is it phrases that they've heard from the TV or that they've heard other people say? Can they be understood by multiple people across environments, or are they really only understood at home? And lastly, can the small amount of speech that they do have keep up with new language experiences? So even if they have 20 words that are really easy to understand, they might know thousands of words. So we want to make sure that they have a way to express themselves because they're understanding so much. So really the bottom line here is that verbal speech doesn't automatically mean that it's functional and that it's functional communication. So this is important because there's no need to choose between verbal speech or AAC. You can do both. AAC can supplement what the child is unable to say verbally. And also, it's not the aim when using AAC that a child's going to develop verbal speech, but often we do find that it's a nice bonus that these children begin imitating what they're hearing consistently on the AAC device. And so that's often nice when we see that. Also, some other reasons why it's important is just because a child is limited verbally, it doesn't mean that they have to have limited expressive skills as well. So we want to provide them with an opportunity to be able to express themselves even if their verbal abilities aren't up to that level. We also don't want to delay their language through a wait-and-see approach because we could be waiting forever, or we could have to play catch-up later on. And often we'll hear people say, well, how long are we supposed to wait, or when should we try? And really there's no official age at which verbal speech can be ruled out. So at that point, if you feel like a child should be saying or should have a lot more language than they do with their verbal speech, that's a good time to introduce AAC for them to help supplement what they do have. So we're not going to watch this video today due to time, but there should be a link in your handout, and it is about a little boy with autism that began using an application, a communication application on the iPad, and they tracked the amount of verbal speech he had in the beginning, and then 6 months after introduction with the AAC device, and his vocabulary grew pretty tremendously. So it's just a nice video, maybe to show parents or coworkers or anyone that has that fear that using AAC is going to limit what they're able to do verbally. So let's go ahead and move on to our second myth. And I want you to raise your hand if you have heard any of the following remarks. Prerequisite skills are required to use AAC. And individuals with cognitive deficits are not able to use AAC. Yep, again, so I see a lot of you have your hands raised. If you've heard these sort of myths, you may have heard people say something like, we can't start doing this yet, he or she just isn't ready, he or she doesn't have the attention to communicate, and unfortunately sometimes we hear people say he or she is just too low, or they don't want to communicate with other people. So let's go ahead and talk about why this is false. Communication can actually help expand cognitive skills. The development between cognitive and language skills is fairly complex, but we do know that sometimes language skills can actually precede cognitive skills. So thinking about a couple of cognitive skills that little kids develop fairly early on is, one is cause and effect. So, for example, maybe a baby babbling, mama, 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 without knowing that it means mama. They're just doing it. They're just playing with their voice. And the mom reacts, oh, you just said mama, oh, mama, mama. And so then the baby does it again because they got a reaction. So they're learning that, oh, if I do something, I get a certain reaction. So again, using language without really knowing the meaning behind it. Means end is another thing that children learn fairly early on, and this is that a certain behavior or action or a certain word can get them something that they want. So a child who goes up to their mom and puts their arms up, they know that their mom's then going to pick them up because they're showing them, I want up. And then lastly, object permanence. This is when children know that even if something is not in sight anymore, that it still exists. So say a child was eating cookies and the mom put the cookies away, and then the child goes back to the cabinet because they want more cookies, and they know that the cookies are still there. And say, cookie, cookie, because they know that the cookies are in there. So these are just some examples of how communication and cognitive skills can kind of go together, and these are good opportunities for teaching language while kids are developing these skills as well. But we have to think too about individuals that have cognitive impairments. They also need to communicate their wants and needs, and so we need to make sure that we give them the opportunity to do this as well. So we're going to go through a couple of true and false questions here. So I want you to go ahead and let me know if you think this is a yes or no, that children with cognitive impairments can't learn if we don't teach them. All right, so let's go ahead and skip to our results. Yeah, kids are not going to be able to learn, any kid is not going to be able to learn if they don't have a model or if they're not taught. So we need to make sure that we're giving these kids a chance before we just say, that no, they can't do it, because we haven't given them a chance to learn. Our next question is, children with cognitive impairments must start with low-tech solutions. All right. So I see that a lot of you said no, which is correct. Presuming competence is really important with this population. We don't know what a child is capable of if we don't give them the opportunity. And you would be surprised a lot of times if you give these kids the opportunity to use something high-tech that they can surprise you. We don't have to start with low-tech. We can often start with a top-down model. And even if it's a child that you're not sure what they understand or what they, where their cognition is, giving them the opportunity is important so that they can show us, if they can or cannot use this. Of course, if you do start with something high-tech and it's too difficult for the child, then at that point it's fine to go down to something low-tech. But we don't have to just assume that because there is a cognitive component with these children that they can't do something high-tech. All right, and our last true or false question, a child does not have to be an independent communicator immediately. And thank you, everybody, for participating. This is true. So yes, a child does not have to be independent right away. So modeling is a very important aspect in learning how to communicate verbally and also with AAC. We don't expect that children that eventually develop verbal speech, that they're just going to learn it on their own. They're not going to be independent right away either. So we have to think about normal development the same way with using AAC, is that these children need models and they need the opportunity to learn, and we're the ones that have to teach them. So they might not be independent right away, and you might have to help them and model and show them, but the goal is for them to eventually be an independent communicator. But it's not going to be something that happens overnight. Again, we have another video example here, and we're not going to go over this right now, but I'm going to give you a little background about this video. This is a family that has several children that have complex communication needs, and they use POD books, which POD stands for Pragmatically Organized Dynamic Display. And these are light-tech AAC supports that offer a robust vocabulary system. And the system is modeled extensively for that receptive or comprehension input before the children are expected to use the system for output. And the family that does this is great with doing so many modeling across environments. The whole family uses it to model for the children. And so this example is a young child who has been having a POD modeled for her for a long time, and she's starting to use it to communicate back to her mother. So again, this just kind of demonstrates the importance of presuming competence and modeling so that the child can learn how to communicate. And so these books often have a lot of pictures, and when you see, looking at this child, you may think, oh, I don't know if I would have started out with that much vocabulary, that could be confusing, but it just goes to show how important the modeling is, because then this child is able to go through and communicate a message to her mom, even though there's that much vocabulary in her book. So I thought that was just a powerful video, again, for you, and also, to share with families or to share with colleagues. And then the last thing here is what we had talked about, presuming competence. And I have a nice quote here from Gail Van Tatenhove back in 2007. And she said, "The use of 2 words and then 3 and 4 words and word endings happen in typically developing kids before the age of 3. So it is not asking too much for kids using AAC to be given the same opportunity for language learning. While all children using AAC are not going to reach the same levels of language proficiency, all children using AAC should be given the opportunity to reach for their highest personal level of language proficiency." So the big takeaway message from that is, these children, we got to give them the opportunity. We got to presume that they can do it until, we maybe assess that something else would be better for them. But we need to give them the opportunity for them to show us what they know and teach them so that they can be good communicators. And we're going to let Cary go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Meg. We're going to move right along to myth number 3, which is the child is too young. And this is something that we hear quite frequently. So I'd like you to use your raise your hand tool if you've heard any of the following statements. She's so little, she doesn't have much to say yet. Or, we'll work on it when he gets to school if he's still behind by then. Or, he can't use it on his own because it's just too complex for him. Raise your hand if you've heard any of those things. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands raised, and you're in very good company because Meg and I have heard all of these things as well. So let's talk about why this is not true. Let's start with that statement that a young child doesn't have much to say yet. Most of us know that this isn't true because we work with kids, and we know that even children as young as a few moments old have something to say. They're communicating already through crying that they need food. So this is a good example of how behavior is often a form of communication for us. We all communicate with each other, even if we aren't talking, through body language, through behaviors, through sounds. But for an infant, crying is an adequate mode of communication because they have a fairly limited range of needs that they need to express. But as a child gets older, their mind expands, and so do their needs. So if you take a look at the picture on the left, at this poor guy with the bubbles, he's trying so hard to tell us something, but we can't be quite sure what it is. We don't know if he doesn't like the bubbles, or if he wants a turn, or maybe he's just having a bad day, but we can't know for sure because he's communicating through that same mode of crying as the infant was. But that mode is no longer adequate at this point because he just has more to say. In contrast, on the right is a little boy that you might recognize from a YouTube video about cookies. It's one of my favorite YouTube videos. And this toddler tells his mom that he only likes her when she gives him cookies. And then he follows this up very precociously by adding, "I love you, Mommy, but I don't like you all the time." So that's kind of the other end of the spectrum, but if you think about the vast communication differences between these two boys and how their developing relationships with their caregivers might differ, if these types of communication interactions repeat over and over and over again, it's just a good case for introducing AAC early. So there's no cut and dry answer to when we should start introducing AAC, but a general rule of thumb is to introduce it when a child's method of communication is no longer adequate to express what they need to say. So let's go on to the statements that we've all heard. We'll work on it when he gets to school if he's still behind by then. So by the time a child reaches kindergarten, their language skills are pretty complex. They're using longer sentences with lots of different vocabulary words, and some early grammar. So for a kid who's just now getting used to using an AAC device, we're throwing them into this huge game of catch-up on top of all the other life changes that poor child is going through at 5 years old. The other piece of that is that school-aged children use language for a variety of functions other than just requesting things. They play, they tattle, they make friends with language, and a child with a brand new device who doesn't really speak the language yet is just not going to be a very effective social being and might have a really hard time making friends, and this might affect them for a very long time down the road. So that statement is too complex for him, or that she can't use it by herself. Well, it's really important here to remember that none of us communicate by ourselves. Communication isn't something that you do by yourself. It's not an individual activity. We all need help sometimes to remember our train of thought or to remember a word. And AAC users are no different than typically developing children who also need help when they're first communicating. So we'll need to help them learn what to say and when to say it, and we might need to remind them how to turn their device on and off, or maybe even carry their device for them sometimes. They don't have to do this all by themselves. And if you've seen kids using technology, you know that even toddlers can be very proficient with touchscreen devices, like sometimes even more proficient than I feel I am. So that it's too complex for him statement just doesn't really hold up when we look at it. So why is all this important? We really need to introduce AAC early. We don't want to wait and see what happens because preschool years are so important in terms of all developmental skills, and we really need to give these kiddos the opportunity to practice this communication before school starts, even if they're not perfect AAC users right away. So moving on to our last myth, go ahead and raise your hand for me if you've heard or maybe even said any of the following remarks. His SLP will teach him how to communicate. That's her speech device. I don't know how to use it. Or he works on that in speech therapy. Go ahead and raise your hand for me if you're familiar with any of those statements. Lots and lots of hands up. Great, thanks for participating. Let's talk about why this is a false myth. We all know that a team approach is important for a child to be successful with anything. So an AAC user needs encouragement and needs to be spoken to on that device by everyone in their life. If we think about a verbal child, if that child was only spoken to verbally by one person in that child's life, that person would probably not learn to be a very effective verbal communicator. So really, a child just won't be successful with an AAC system if using the system is only addressed for a half an hour or an hour a week. Let's talk about a little bit more about why that is. So typically developing children will have been exposed to verbal speech for over 4,000 hours by the time that they're 18 months old, so on the later range of when we would expect to hear first words. So we know now that children need exposure to the language they're expected to use in order to communicate with that language. So let's think about a child using AAC. They need exposure to someone else using AAC. So I want to do a quick poll. I'll kind of read the question first and then navigate over to the poll. So for a child using AAC to gain that same amount of language exposure, so if someone's speaking their language, that a verbal child receives by 18 months, if the device was only used for 20 to 30 minutes a week, how long do you think it would take that child to get the same exposure to their language as a typically developing 18-month-old? So I'm going to go over to this poll here. And go ahead and click your answer for me. Do you think it's 5 years, 26 years, 47 years, or 84 years? Okay, and they can keep doing it. Give you a few more seconds. Great, so it looks like the bulk of you have said you would think it would take about 84 years, and actually that is the right answer. So unless we want it to take more than 3/4 of a century for these children to produce their first true meaningful words on their AAC system, we really need to be giving them constant exposure to use of that language system, and that means we need to have everybody on board, everybody doing modeling. So why is this important? It really takes a village to make sure that that child has adequate exposure to somebody speaking their language in all environments. And when we make decisions about the child's AAC, these need to be team-based. Who better to know those communication needs of the child than the adults who are around the child all day long? So even though the SLP might be considered the expert in communication, the real expert on the child is the parent. So the parents and other team members really need to be involved when we're making decisions about goals and needs of the AAC user. So who is part of the AAC team? The answer isn't listed on this slide because it truly depends on the child and who is involved in that child's day-to-day lives. So those children's day-to-day lives. So some obvious team members are going to be the child's family, obviously. They're around the family a lot. The family is home with them every night where a lot of communication takes place. The SLP is really going to be an important team member, and regular education and special education teachers are often going to be involved. But there may be some other players we might not think of right away depending on the child. If that child is getting other therapies like occupational therapy or physical therapy, those therapists are going to be very important members of the AAC team because that child needs to be able to communicate in other therapies too. Other team members might be a psychologist, a social worker, a case manager, maybe the child's doctor or a nurse, maybe an ABA provider who's spending a lot of time each week with that child. And one of my favorites that is sometimes the most powerful is the sibling. Sometimes when siblings model language on the device, it just really clicks for the child. So this Venn diagram really illustrates the way in which the roles of SLP and the other team members really meld together. So while it's initially the SLP's job to get the family and the child up to speed on the device, the roles quickly become team roles. So programming vocabulary might start by being the SLP's job, but this soon will become a shared responsibility because the SLP isn't following the child around all day when vocabulary might need to be added or if something might go wrong with the device. And just like that, the SLP might initially need to be modeling the use of the device and teaching the family how to do this, but speaking this language in all environments, like we've talked about, is the job of everybody. We really need to empower caregivers to provide good models of AAC use. And so coaching and encouragement may need to come not just from the SLP, but from other therapists and other professionals in the child's life. So hopefully now we've debunked all of the myths, and we can move on to how do you actually do it? How do you teach AAC? We use something called aided language input. So here's the problem we're trying to solve when we use aided language input. Like we talked about earlier, most people learn the way they are supposed to communicate by hearing, by receiving thousands and thousands of hours of input of verbal language during the first few years of their lives. But these kiddos are expected to communicate through aided language, or AAC, and are constantly exposed to the same input, that verbal speech, which is not the language that we're expecting them to use. So it's like speaking to a child in English and expecting them to magically speak Mandarin. But that doesn't mean we should stop talking to them. We just need to change our input a little bit. So let me show you what this looks like. Here's a typical exchange maybe between a parent and a child at lunchtime, a verbal child. So maybe the dad would say, "It's almost lunchtime. I think I want to eat. You look really hungry too. Did you want to eat? How about we eat some grapes? I know you like grapes. I'll go get some. Those are good grapes." So we'll still say the same thing, but instead of that, we'll do this. And I'm going to use this pointer kind of as my finger. So I would say, it's almost lunchtime. I think I want to eat. You look hungry too. Do you want to eat? Maybe we should eat some grapes. You like grapes. I'll go get some. So when we use aided language input, we're basically pointing to the words on our child's system as we say them. We're still talking to the child verbally or the way we usually would, but we're pointing out or using words on their device as they come up in our verbal speech. So when we use aided language input, we really need to remember that we're not trying to get our child to talk. We're just showing them how. There's a wonderful paragraph in the handbook from the Hannon program for parents called It Takes Two to Talk that says asking your child to say words for you doesn't really help her to learn language. In fact, it can have the opposite effect because it takes the joy out of communication. Your child knows when you really want to communicate with her and when you're just wanting to hear her say a word. So we're modeling or showing the child without the expectation that they repeat. So emergent communicators, these are kiddos who have fewer than 50 words, and many of these kids haven't realized the power of communication yet. So we know that even if a child isn't talking, they're still communicating. So we're going to use a watch, comment, model method. So the key is to watch what they're communicating to you non-verbally, purposely or not, and pair those behaviors with what they could say. So here's an example. First, you watch. You're playing a song on the iPad in your therapy session that you're sure the child will love, but the little boy grimaces and places his hands on his ears. So then you're going to comment on what you see. You might say, uh-oh, you're covering your ears. It looks like you don't like it. And then you're going to model what they could say. So you could say, don't like, or stop, while pointing to don't like and stop on the child's board or on their device. So we want to create opportunities for communication by finding out what makes the child tick. Is it music or cars or movement? And when we're thinking about engagement, we want to make sure we remember sensory activities. These are often really motivating for these kids who may have multiple disabilities or complex bodies or unmet sensory needs. And there's so much we can say during movement activities. We can say go, stop, turn, fast, or using Play-Doh or putty or shaving cream. We can say look, more, help, like, don't. So we can wrap communication into any activity that's engaging. Once we find these activities, we want to repeat them so that the child gets lots and lots of practice. And then once the child has that routine down, we're going to sabotage the activity. And by doing this, we're going to create opportunities for the child to communicate. So maybe once we've done a lot of bubble blowing, uh-oh, the bubbles are closed so tightly, we can't open them while pointing to the word open. If the platform swing is on the ground, instead of hanging up where it should be, now we have a chance to say up. But we need to remember the first time we sabotage these activities, we have to show the child a way out by modeling what they could say, or otherwise it's just not going to end well and we're going to end up with a frustrated kiddo. We're going to want to use think aloud strategies, and this is just when we say our thought process out loud so that we can show the child what they could say. So we might say, those bubbles look like they're closed tightly. I wonder if you need help to open them, while pointing at those words on the device. And we want to use errorless learning techniques. This just means that we make words meaningful by responding to anything the child says with their system, even if it was just on accident, if they're just pressing buttons. And one of my favorite examples of errorless learning was with my little friend named Caleb. He has autism, and I met him when he was just 2. And at that time, he really only had 10 very inconsistent word approximations, but was a really bright kid. He understood almost everything, but really got frustrated when he couldn't express himself. So I introduced AAC with him right away. And one of his favorite toys was this pirate ship that played a lot of fun piratey music. So I kept modeling the word dance on his device, and his mom and I would dance. And Caleb thought this was so funny, he wanted to be in charge, and so he started directing us to dance. Well, on the same page as the word dance, there were a lot of other verbs that we hadn't even talked about yet. And Caleb started exploring these too, and Mom and I would respond appropriately. So during the session, he inadvertently told his mom and me to clap, to sleep, and finally to pray. And now he knows what all these words mean and where they are on his device because he thought it was so funny that he did it over and over and over again. So that's just my favorite example of using errorless learning techniques. They really work. So even though we want to do lots of modeling, we also need to practice waiting because we have to give the chance for the child to talk. And if we're talking the whole time, they don't have a chance to do that. But waiting is an art. And Dora the explorer is definitely the Michelangelo of waiting. Dora sometimes waits for what seems to an adult to be an eternity for her viewers to respond, and she's a good example of how the power of a pause can make even a full-grown adult talk to a television set. But the truth is that the power of a pause can really work wonders. If you don't wait long enough for a response and you keep prompting the child, you might interrupt their processing and steal their turn. But waiting too long, you risk losing them and losing their engagement and a chance for communication. So the length of wait time is going to be different for each kid, obviously. I recommend starting with 5 seconds and adjusting from there through trial and error. So real quickly, we're going to talk about using AAC in daily routines. This is important because parents really prefer interventions that are easy to do. And working on language through routines makes the work fit into their daily lives. Routines allow for multiple chances to practice the same thing over and over again, which helps kids learn. The routines are functional, they're natural learning opportunities, and they teach language that kids are actually going to use during the day. But it's important to remember that routines are not just brushing your teeth, putting on your shoes. They're anything that the child and the parent are doing together every day or regularly. So that could be going for walks around the neighborhood or running to the door to greet dad when he gets home. So we really need to encourage parents to recognize these as routines also and to pair these routines with consistent language. So we know we're doing it right when we feel like we're saying the same words over and over and over, and this gives a chance to model that language on the AAC system over and over and over. So we might say up for out of bed, or on for turning water on for teeth brushing, or help for tying the child's shoes. So what happens when you've done this 100 times and the child anticipates what's coming next, and then you forget to turn the water on, or you just hand the child the shoe instead of helping them with it? So all of a sudden, there's this beautiful opportunity for the child to tell you what to do next. And luckily, we've already modeled that language over and over for the child. I'll touch really quickly on core vocabulary. These are heavily research-based, kind of bang-for-your-buck words that can be used all across different types of routines. These make up 80% of the words that you and I use, so 80% of what I've said over the last 20 minutes have been core vocabulary words. So these are words like go and stop and that, not words like train or potato chips or ball. The word train is great if you're playing with a train, but if you're playing with anything else or doing anything else, you're kind of up a creek if you're stuck with the word train. So core words like the ones on this board are way more flexible, and we need those specific words like train too, but we want to make sure we give the child a good number of core words so that we can be ready to model the language no matter what happens during the routine. So let's move on to caregiver education and coaching. We know that caregivers are almost always really busy, and the idea of doing therapy outside of therapy sessions can also be a little bit intimidating. So at Children's Hospital of Richmond, we found that supports for parents really need to be structured, easy to use, and that the parents have to use them frequently at home for the supports to be successful. So I want to share just a couple of resources we've developed at Children's Hospital of Richmond, and several of these should have been included in your email, probably your most recent email about the webinar. So one of these things is our recipes for success, and these are just recipes for fun, common activities, many of which families probably already have laying around the house, so like an inflatable ball, a doll, a puzzle, and the recipes lay out the specific words to work on during the activity and how to work on them. So we actually provide a step-by-step instruction and script for modeling the language, for setting up the environment, for taking turns using the AAC system. And it lists out which words you can use for different functions of communication. So what do you say if you want to request something? What do you say if you need to ask for help or if you want to tell someone what to do? So this particular recipe is for paint markers or bingo markers, but if I showed you multiple activities, chances are that a lot of the words would be the same words from activity to activity. And lastly, at the bottom, there's a paragraph that talks about ways to generalize this language to other routines. We usually demonstrate the activity in the session with the parent, and then the parent is encouraged to try the activity again at home for carryover. We have a number of library books that we have adapted, and we've just adapted them by gluing or taping the symbol sequences for words on a child's device inside the book in strategic places. And this is actually really for the parent, so that when the parent is reading the book, they'll have a visual cue of which words on which pages they can model during book reading. So you can see at the bottom on that book that's open some of the symbols that we've placed there. And these are just so easy to make, and you can just use the symbols from the child's device. I'm seeing a question pop up. Thanks for those resources. Can we share them with colleagues? Absolutely. There should also be in your in the resources that were given to you, there's a list of some of our favorites that we use here. So if you see anything on that list, feel free to shoot an email over to me or to Meg. Our emails are at the end, and we'd be happy to share anything with you guys. I think we've done it in a way so that our logo will stay on it, but if for some reason that's not the case, please just keep our logo on it to make us happy and our manager happy. So moving on, we're almost done. We'll have some time for questions at the end, but one of the things we find really important, oops, hold on here. Oh, I skipped one. This is our AAC home log, and we use this a lot. This is just a form that we use to provide instruction and also just for deciding what the family is going to focus on for the next week. So it provides an area for the family to give us some feedback for the next session so we know what to address, like what went really well or where do they need some extra guidance. And this should have been included in your handouts if you'd like to use with your families or share with any colleagues. So we found that really the most important thing is to give the family plenty of time to watch us, but to actually involve the family, because most families learn better by doing. So we often have the parent watch once, then join us in the activity, and then sometimes lead the activity. But if that caregiver feels nervous about modeling the language in front of us, we can have them take a video of themselves doing the activity with the device at home and show us in the next session. So that's something that we sometimes do. So kind of in closing, before we move on to questions, to summarize, giving the gift of language through AAC is really a journey and can be a really long journey, but we have to teach language by using that language and doing it over and over again. Learning how to speak a new language for anybody, much less our kiddos, is a process, and so we really want to give them a leg up by starting that process as early as possible. So thank you so much for being here today and being good active participants. So I think we have about 7 minutes for questions. So we'd be happy to answer some now, and if we run out of time, I'm thinking you can probably, Deb can email us some of these questions.
It looks like we have one question that says, how could you address young children whose families speak other languages at home via AAC? So that is a really good question and something that we've run into quite frequently. We actually have a pretty big population of Spanish-speaking families that we serve at Children's Hospital of Richmond, and we have actually adapted several of our activities into Spanish through our Spanish translator that we have at the hospital. We often have interpreters come into the sessions with us so that anything that we're saying to the families, can get translated to them. And then, again, we'll provide them handouts that they can have at home that have instructions in their language. And often, too, with certain families, we'll ask them in the beginning, we can either get the device in their native language or we can get the device in English. And same with if you were using something low-tech, we can do it in English or Spanish, say, and give that family the opportunity to let us know what they would prefer. Oftentimes, a lot of families actually do prefer them to be in English because that's what the child's going to be exposed to at school, and so the device may be in English, and then we'll give the family kind of a little key that has all of the words in English translated into Spanish, so then that family knows how to model, even though the words on their device are in English.
Okay, we have another question. What are some devices and software programs that you found to be most effective with this young age group? Meg, you can chime in too if you have anything to add, but I feel like devices and software that provide a lot of core vocabulary are really probably the most effective for this age group just because they're the most flexible. So there are a lot of programs that run on the iPad as well as several dedicated devices that are really good. But I also think it's important to note that some lower light tech version of any device you're using is really, really essential to have because a lot of those more high-tech devices are going to at some point have a problem. They're not going to plug in, or you're going to be out in the sunlight and not be able to see them. So I think a low-tech or light-tech board, like the one that I did some modeling on earlier in the presentation, are really effective and essential as well.
And we've got another question. For the frequently used caregiver handouts, are those ones that I would just Google the title and they'll come up, or it's ones you have developed or found over the years and use at your center? Yes, the frequently used caregiver handouts are ones that we've developed at our site. And so Cary had said if you want to see some more of those resources, like if there's one that sounds like something you would be interested in, you can either just email Cary or myself or both of us, and we can share those resources with you. You may be able to Google and find some similar things, but the specific things that we are talking about are ones that we've created.
Okay, next question. Where do you start if the child doesn't have a device, or where do you start with lower tech board? Do you have a link? So I probably, if the child doesn't have a device and there is not an available one that can be loaned to me, I will say several of the device companies sometimes will provide loaner devices for different clinics, so that's one thing you could try. I also know that many states have lending libraries, so that's also something you could try. But in terms of lower tech boards, I would honestly look at Pinterest because there are a lot of lower tech boards that are already made, and there's just no reason to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So I might check that out. Lauren Enders is an AAC provider who has some awesome boards up on Pinterest for different activities and different boards. So I might start there and just kind of see what you can find. You can certainly make some core boards just even on like Board Maker and that kind of thing, but check and see what's already out there just to avoid having to do a lot of extra work.
The next question we have is, do you think AAC apps should be used on dedicated tablets, or can they be used on tablets that are used for other activities? That's a good question. So we've had families and children that have used both. I think that if a family has an iPad or a tablet and wants to try a communication device and wants to, purchase it themselves, that's fine. We just always let the family know that sometimes children might get frustrated if they know that iPad can go to their games and their music. If we lock them into the communication app, they may sometimes get frustrated and not want to use it. So that's something that we have run into with families. I think it just depends on the child. Sometimes families may have two iPads, so they designate one as the communication iPad and one as the fun iPad. So that I think that has been helpful as well. We tend to go dedicated when we can if we know that that's going to be an issue. If they have if they have funding or funding's available to them. So again, it just kind of depends on the child.
And I am going to answer one last question, and then if there are more questions, and Deb, I'm seeing some more questions pop up. I'm hopeful that those can be emailed to us and we can respond to those as well. But the last question we're going to have time to answer is, what do you use with children who have aggressive tendencies? And what a tricky question. I feel like in my practice, a lot of those aggressive tendencies come as the result of not being able to communicate. So first of all, bravo for wanting to incorporate AAC with a child who has aggressive tendencies, because that might be just what they need. I feel like a lot of the devices that are available to be funded through insurance are considered durable medical equipment. That doesn't mean that they can't be broken, but I will say that they are more durable than one would think. So if part of your question was wondering about durability of these devices with aggressive children, that shouldn't be a reason to not try them. I would also consider light tech or low tech in terms of not wanting to destroy the device. But I would also look at the child and try to figure out when are they being most aggressive, what might they be trying to say with their aggression. Certainly a lot of times it's probably that they don't like something or they want someone to stop or leave them alone. So I would just make sure to have vocabulary available so that you can model that vocabulary when they're having those moments of aggression, and show the child that if we can say those things, stop, don't like it, often that thing that's bothering them will go away. Try to make those words really meaningful for that child. So that's probably where I would start. So I think we probably are going to wrap up now because Meg and I have some kiddos to go see. But we both just want to thank you so much for joining us and letting us talk to you about this information that we think is really, really important. And I see that there are some other questions popping up, so we will try our best to get back to you on those questions, and we hope that you have a great day.
Yeah, and like we said, if you have any other questions or want any more resources, please feel free to email either one of us. And thank you all for joining.